On Christmas morning, I thought I was bringing my family joy. Instead, I watched my mother look me dead in the eyes and say the kind of words you can't unhear. I had just told her my girlfriend was pregnant with my child, her first grandchild. She didn't even blink. "I don't want you or that bastard baby in this family. You're dead to me and out of the will." Just like that. No hesitation. No mercy. I stood there holding the gift I spent weeks preparing, realizing I'd never been a son to her, just a legacy she needed to control. So I placed the box on the table, wished her a hollow Merry Christmas, and walked out into the snow. I thought that was the end of it. But when she opened what was inside, she screamed nonstop. And in that moment, the truth about who she really was finally came undone. Before I share my story, I want to know you're here with me. Just say "listening" in the comments, or tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far my story can reach, or my story. Sometimes even the smallest connection makes a story feel heard. And if you can please consider subscribing to the channel, it helps more than you know, especially when stories like mine aren't easy to tell. Thank you. My name is Alder Knox, and this is what happened. My name is Alder Knox, and for most of my 30 years, I've lived between two worlds, the one I was born into in Aspen and the one I chose for myself in Denver. At Denver General Hospital, I serve as a charge nurse in the ER. My days are long, my nights unpredictable, but pressure is the one thing I've never been afraid of. In the trauma bay, crises make sense. Pain has a cause. Bleeding has a source. Even heartbreak has a protocol. Out there in that clean white chaos, I know who I am. Which is more than I can say about the man I am when I'm back in Aspen, surrounded by people who claim to be my family but have never understood the choices that shaped me. I met Isla on a night shift where the city seemed determined to break itself. She came in with road rash on her shoulder and a cracked helmet in her lap, cursing in frustration but smiling at every nurse who tried to help. There was something disarmingly warm about her. Something grounded, something real in a way that most people in Aspen never were. When she laughed, it was the kind of laugh that didn't ask for permission to take up space. I cleaned her wounds, wrapped her arm, and listened to her tell me about the design she was working on for a client. She didn't shrink under the fluorescent hospital light. She glowed. She came back a week later to check her bandages, then again just to drop off coffee as a thank you, though she didn't even try to hide the fact that she wasn't there for her arm. We fell into each other slowly then, all at once, the way people do when they've spent too long pretending they don't need anyone. But Aspen never let go of me completely. My mother, Marjorie Knox, ruled that town like she owned the mountains themselves. In her world, our family's legacy, the hotels, the ski properties, the Knox name, mattered more than the people who carried it. I grew up rehearsing the future she planned for me: business school boardrooms, a wife who understood which fork to use and which people to avoid. Brennan, my younger brother, was always the golden child despite doing nothing to earn it. I was the dutiful son until the day I realized duty was just another cage made of polished wood and good intentions. So I left. I rented a tiny apartment in Denver, took double shifts, and promised myself I would never again let anyone choose my life for me. Still, when Isela told me she was pregnant, something inside me cracked open. Joy, fear, disbelief, and hope all surged at once. I imagined holding my child. I imagined introducing my mother to her first grandchild. I imagined foolishly that the woman who raised me might soften in the face of something so innocent. I let myself believe she might see me, really see me for the first time. That naive hope was enough to push me toward a decision I thought I would never make. I would return to Aspen for Christmas and tell my family the truth. Before driving up the mountain, I packed a single bag and wrapped a small rectangular gift in red paper. Inside that box were documents I had gathered over months, proof of things I wished weren't real truths I never wanted to confront. I didn't plan to use them unless everything went wrong, but something in my gut told me I needed to be ready. As I placed the gift in my coat pocket, I felt a flicker of dread beneath all the hope. I didn't know then that this one trip home, this one Christmas night, would end my place in the Knox family forever. Before the explosion of that Christmas night, there had been warnings cracks beneath the perfect holiday smiles. The first time I brought Isela to the Aspen house, the Knox home was dusted with snow and dressed in pine wreaths like something out of a luxury catalog. The long dining room table gleamed under dim amber lights, and behind the glass windows the Rockies stretched across the horizon like a cold, unmoving wall. Stepping inside with Isela at my side, I felt the familiar weight settle onto my shoulders, the kind of heaviness only a childhood home can produce. My mother greeted us with a smile so polished it might as well have been carved from ice. Before the appetizers were even served, she asked Isela about her income, her retirement plans, and whether being a tattoo artist was sustainable long-term. Each question was wrapped in politeness, but delivered like a cut. I saw her eyes drift down Isela's arms, tracking every line of ink with silent judgment. In her mind, tattoos weren't art. They were signs of people who belonged far below her imagined social tier. From that moment, I knew she never intended to accept the woman I loved. Brennan made everything worse. At 24, he still lived off my mother, drifting between video games and half-hearted business ideas. He didn't hide his smirk as he asked if Isela had backup plans or if she found her clients from the streets. I felt the heat rise in my chest every time he spoke, but I kept quiet for Isela's sake. What made it unbearable was knowing Brennan's arrogance was built on money that wasn't even his. Money I would later discover came straight from accounts our parents never meant him to touch. For years I thought my father was the neutral one, the quiet observer who let storms pass. But one evening after dinner, he handed me his phone to show me an old picture from a ski trip. When I swiped, a text thread popped up. It was between him and my mother. They weren't discussing business. They were discussing me. Line after line, I saw them talk about redirecting my future, about limiting outside influences, about guiding me toward a suitable match. My father, the man I believed stayed out of these battles, had been helping orchestrate them behind the scenes. The final blow came when I discovered something darker. While cleaning out a box in my mother's study during a visit, I found a folder photos of Isela stepping out of her studio, meeting friends at cafes, shopping for groceries. Dates, times, locations. A private investigator's watermark stamped across every print. My mother had hired someone to follow her. I tucked the folder back exactly as I found it and said nothing, not wanting to burden Isela with the ugliness of a family she didn't ask to be part of. But from that moment on, I understood that my mother wasn't just disapproving, she was calculating. That night's dinner felt like a trial. Every sentence from my mother turned into a verdict on my choices. Every glance from Brennan dared me to break. And somewhere between the roasted lamb and dessert, I realized I was standing at a crossroads. I could keep pretending to be the son they wanted, or I could choose the life I was building with the woman I loved. By the time I left Aspen that night, I knew the truth. I couldn't belong to both worlds. And Christmas would force the decision once and for all. The cracks began long before Christmas, long before the snow piled against my windows in Denver. They started with the calls from my mother that came at the end of every shift, always at the worst possible time, as if she had a sixth sense for when I was too tired to fight back. Each call felt like a script she had rehearsed. She never asked how I was doing or how the ER had been that night. She went straight for the jugular. Had I come to my senses yet? Had I realized a woman with tattoos was not wife material? Had I finally ended things with that girl from the shop? Her voice carried the same cold pressure I grew up under, and I hated how easily it slipped under my skin. One night, after a 12-hour shift that bled into a 13th, I stared at her name flashing on my phone and simply walked out of the hospital without clocking out. I couldn't bear to hear her say my name with that disappointed sigh again. I sat in my car with the engine off, forehead against the steering wheel, feeling like a child again, cornered, judged, and exhausted. Then there were the messages from Brennan. He never called. That required more effort than he was willing to give. Instead, he sent short texts designed to provoke, to poke the soft spots he knew too well. A tattoo artist, seriously, you think she'll help pay for diapers? Or mom says she's embarrassed. Honestly, I am too. They came at random hours, often when I was at work, and every time my phone buzzed, something tightened in my chest. The last time I saw him in Aspen for a quick weekend visit, we nearly came to blows in the hallway after he muttered something about Isela collecting men like she collected ink. I saw red for a second, my fist halfway raised before I stopped myself. That was exactly what he wanted. I could see it in the smug tilt of his smile. If I swung, he would have run straight to our mother, claiming I was unstable, dangerous, unfit to be around the family. It was all a trap, and I knew it. But what finally broke the illusion that my family's dysfunction was just emotional manipulation came disguised as something innocuous. My father asked me to help him review some financial documents because he couldn't make sense of the numbers. He handed me a folder during a visit, muttering about being overwhelmed with the transition of funds related to one of the family hotels. But the numbers didn't confuse him. They confused me. Money was disappearing in predictable monthly patterns, always in round amounts that didn't match any official expense. I followed the trail silently, my stomach sinking with every page until it led to a private account under Brennan's name. A secret slush fund funded by the family trust quietly siphoned away behind my father's back. It wasn't just a matter of mother enabling my brother. This was theft. This was manipulation at the structural level. And suddenly all the pieces of my childhood made sense. Brennan wasn't the golden child. He was the dependent my mother needed to feel powerful. The next blow came from someone who didn't owe me anything. A colleague at the hospital, Dr. Klein, pulled me aside during a shift and asked if Isila was doing okay after that conversation with my mother. I didn't understand at first. Isila had never mentioned it. But as he explained, the truth cut deeper than anything Brennan had said. Months earlier, my mother had shown up at the hospital unannounced, dressed to intimidate, and asked to speak with Isila privately. According to what Klein overheard, she told my girlfriend that I wasn't strong enough to live a poor life, that I would eventually leave her, that I was only going through a phase and would return to the family once I was done playing around. And Isila never said a word to me. She had carried that humiliation alone, protecting me from choosing sides before I was ready. After that day, something inside me hardened. I began collecting everything. Every email from my mother where she tried to dictate the direction of my life. Every text where she belittled my relationship. Every proof of the money funneled to Brennan. I requested copies of my medical records notes from checkups that showed elevated blood pressure, fatigue, and stress-related symptoms that began the moment the tension with my family escalated. I reached out to the lawyer who once handled my grandfather Harlan's affairs, asking if he still had a copy of the old estate documents. He did. What he sent me made me sit down slowly at my kitchen table. It was a version of the will I had never seen signed before his death, containing conditions none of us had ever been told about. Conditions that mattered now more than ever. By then it was clear to me that Christmas wouldn't be a celebration. It would be a line in the sand. I didn't tell Isela what I had discovered. She was already trying to navigate her pregnancy while working at her studio, and I didn't want to add the weight of my family's darkness to her shoulders. But inside I knew the truth. The holiday gathering in Aspen wouldn't just be tense. It would be the final confrontation, the moment where everything either came clean or burned down completely, and I had no idea which outcome I feared more. December in Denver has a way of settling into your bones. The air was sharp, the sky low and gray, and every morning I woke with the same heavy thought pressing against my chest. Christmas was getting closer. Isela had begun to show the soft curve of her stomach visible beneath her loose sweaters, and each time I saw her rest her hand over the growing life inside her, something fierce stirred in me. The urge to protect her was constant, instinctive, almost primal. I knew that whatever happened in Aspen could no longer be about my relationship with my parents. It was about the future, standing quietly inside our small apartment, humming as she made tea, sketching designs, occasionally wincing when the baby kicked. I packed lightly for the trip up the mountain. A few clothes, toiletries, and the small red gift box that now felt far heavier than its actual weight. Even holding it made me uneasy. This little box contained months of secrets, and somewhere deep down, I knew there was no version of events where opening it didn't change my family forever. As I set my luggage by the door, I tried to convince myself that maybe the worst wouldn't happen. Maybe the announcement of their first grandchild would cut through the fog of judgment. But hope felt thin and breakable, stretched too tight across everything I knew about my mother. The last conversation I had with her before Christmas lasted barely 2 minutes. She called while I was making dinner. Her tone was unusually cordial, which immediately put me on guard. She asked one question. Are you bringing anyone to the house this year? Not how are you or how's work, just that. I told her I had important news to share. On the other end, I heard the faintest sigh, the kind people make when they've already decided they won't like the answer. When I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, staring at the phone in my hand, knowing she was bracing herself for a disappointment she believed she could control. Later that night, a friend from Aspen sent me a photo he'd taken by chance. It showed my father walking into the office of our longtime family attorney. There was nothing inherently suspicious about the image, but the timing was wrong. My father never visited the attorney alone unless something major was happening. Suddenly, the wary silence on his end of the phone for the past few weeks made sense. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to be preparing for whatever storm was coming. Knowing he had information I hadn't shared yet made the air around me feel colder. I realized I wasn't just heading into a tense holiday. I was heading into a battle I wasn't sure I was fully prepared for. A few days later, while finishing a shift at the hospital, one of the attending physicians pulled me aside. He mentioned casually that my mother had called the HR department earlier that week to ask about my work schedule and express concerns about my professionalism. My stomach tightened. She wasn't calling for updates. She was building a narrative. That realization settled into me like a stone. She wasn't simply disappointed in my choices. She was preparing a case against me just in case she needed one. Sleep became a stranger after that. I lay awake night after night listening to Isela breathe softly beside me, wondering whether I was walking my family toward reconciliation or destruction. I'd stare at the ceiling, replaying every conversation I had ever had with my mother, trying to understand when exactly she stopped seeing me as her son and started seeing me as a threat to everything she built her identity on. Sometimes I would get up and stand in the doorway of the small room we planned to turn into a nursery. The walls were still bare, the crib unassembled, but imagining our child there made everything sharper, every fear, every hope, every decision I was about to make. I began drafting a letter to my family, not an apology, not a plea, but a final statement of who I had become, of the life I was choosing. I rewrote it 3 times, each version more honest than the last. In the quiet hours before dawn, I placed the folded pages inside the red box with the other documents and closed the lid. When I stepped back and looked at it sitting on the table, I felt a ripple of something I couldn't name. It looked harmless, like any other holiday gift. Yet everything inside it had the potential to unravel the Knox family from the inside out. As I zipped up my suitcase the night before the drive to Aspen, I paused one last time, staring at the gift box in my coat pocket. I didn't know whether it would save me or ruin what little remained between my parents and me. I only knew that keeping the truth hidden any longer would be its own kind of betrayal. And with that thought, I turned off the lights, locked the door, and prepared to face whatever waited for me in the mountains. By the time I reached Aspen, the snow was piled high against the driveway, clean and untouched, like the whole estate had been waiting for me. The Knox house glowed under strings of warm lights, every window framed in garlands, the kind of holiday scene people put on Christmas cards. Inside, classical music drifted through the hallways, smooth and elegant, but to me it sounded like the overture before a battle. I stepped through the front doors with my jaw tight, the red gift box heavy inside my coat pocket. My mother stood on the top step overlooking the foyer, one hand wrapped around the banister like she owned not just the house but the mountain itself. She didn't smile. Her eyes swept over me with that familiar cold appraisal, as if she was scanning a piece of property that had depreciated in value. My father lingered near the fireplace, hands in his pockets, staring at the flames instead of at me. Brennan was sprawled on the sofa, scrolling through his phone with the kind of bored disinterest he'd perfected since adolescence. I didn't bother with small talk. My voice sounded steadier than I felt when I said the words I'd practiced for days. Isela is pregnant. I'm going to be a father. Relief, fear, and anticipation all swirled in my chest. For a moment I actually believed there might be a pause, a breath, where something human would flicker in my mother's expression. Instead, she exploded. I don't want you or that bastard baby in this family, she shouted, her voice slicing through the air sharper than the wind outside. You're dead to me, and you're out of the will. It hit like a punch to the sternum. Even though I had prepared myself for rejection, I hadn't been ready for how easily she said it, how final she made it sound. For 30 years, my mother's approval had been the currency of survival in this house. Hearing her revoke it so cleanly made something inside me collapse and straighten at the same time. I looked at my father, hoping idiotically that he might intervene. But he didn't even flinch. His silence wasn't confusion or shock. It was the silence of a man who had been briefed beforehand, a man who had already signed whatever needed to be signed. That realization settled into me colder than the snow outside. In that room, I didn't have a single ally. Not one. For 3 seconds, everything froze. My mother's rage, my father's silence, Brennan's smirk. In those 3 seconds, I understood something that had been growing quietly for years. I had never belonged to this family. Not really. I had been tolerated as long as I followed the script, and the moment I didn't, this was the cost. I reached into my coat slowly and deliberately and placed the red gift box on the long wooden table in the living room. My fingers left faint traces of melted snow on the polished surface. "You should open that," I said, my voice low enough that only the three of them could hear. I didn't wait for a reaction. Crossing the foyer felt like peeling chains from my body, one link at a time. The cold air hit my face as I opened the front door, and I welcomed it. But just as I stepped onto the porch, Brennan's voice cut through the quiet behind me. "You think you won," he muttered. "She'll crush you." I stopped for half a heartbeat. Not because I cared what he thought, but because his voice held something I hadn't heard from him before: fear. Whatever he imagined was inside that box scared him enough to try and get the last word. I didn't turn around. I walked straight into the snow, letting the wind swallow the house behind me. I didn't know then that the loudest destruction was still waiting inside that box, waiting to detonate the moment my mother lifted the lid. 3 days after Christmas at 6 in the morning, my phone rang. The name on the screen made my stomach clench: the family attorney. His voice trembled in a way I'd never heard before. "She opened it," he whispered. "And she lost control." Later he told me she hadn't even waited an hour after I left. She tore the wrapping paper off in the middle of the night like someone trying to claw their way into a locked room. Inside, she found everything I had collected: bank statements showing the missing trust funds funneled to Brennan's private account, screenshots of messages where she demeaned me and my relationship records from a private investigator she hired to follow Isola, and the letter I had written with every ounce of honesty I had left. But none of that compared to the final envelope, the copy of my grandfather Harlan's original estate directives. When she read the clause stating that any attempt to remove me from the will would immediately transfer Harlan's personal assets directly to me, something inside her snapped. The attorney said her scream echoed through the house loud enough that 2 housekeepers rushed upstairs thinking she had fallen or been hurt. But she wasn't hurt. She was furious and terrified. What shook me even more than her reaction was what the attorney revealed next. My father had known about the clause for weeks. He had discovered it during a meeting shortly before Christmas, and had chosen not to tell her, afraid of how she would respond. Suddenly, his silence during my mother's outburst made sickening sense. He wasn't supporting her. He was scared of her. He had been scared for years, and I had been too blind to see it. That afternoon, while I was still processing everything, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Brennan stood on the landing, shivering in the Denver cold. His face was pale eyes, sunken hands trembling from either fear or withdrawal from whatever comfort money usually bought him. "She's out of control," he said before I could speak. "She's breaking things, screaming at everyone, calling new investigators to track you down. She wants to go public with everything. She wants to make you look unhinged before the truth gets out." I stared at him, and for the first time in my life I saw panic instead of arrogance. He wasn't there to mock me. He was there because the house was crumbling, and he didn't know how to survive without the structure our mother had built around him. But I wasn't the older brother who would fix things anymore. I wasn't the child who had been raised to protect the family reputation at all costs. This time I had someone else to protect. Someone who hadn't even been born yet. When Brennan stepped back into the cold, I closed the door and locked it. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the air heavier. I turned off the lights and stood by the window watching snow fall over Denver's quiet streets. I thought about Isola sleeping in the bedroom, her hand resting over the baby she carried. I thought about the Knox estate hundreds of miles away, shaking at its foundation. Only one decision remained, and I knew it had to be made now. I called my attorney to file a restraining order, and as the city grew quieter beneath the snow, I understood that the next step would sever every remaining thread between me and the family I grew up in. There was no turning back, only forward into a world I would have to build myself far from the ruins of the Knox name. I was back in Denver when the call came. The family attorney told me my mother was organizing a small press gathering at the Aspen House, trying to regain control of the narrative after everything that had surfaced. She wanted to present herself as the dignified matriarch under attack, to paint me as the ungrateful son manipulated by a woman she refused to acknowledge with basic respect. Hearing that, something inside me settled. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to reflect or apologize or try to understand. She was preparing for a fight, and I couldn't let her rewrite the story to protect her image. I knew I had to be there. Not to reconcile, to finish what had already begun. The drive up the mountains felt different this time. I wasn't the son returning home hoping to be accepted. I wasn't the child bracing for disappointment. I was a man walking back into the place that raised me but never truly saw me, bringing with me everything they had spent years trying to bury. As the miles passed, I thought about the mold they'd tried to fit me into, the expectations that had shaped my life, and the crushing realization that I had never been treated as an individual with my own desires. I had been a title and heir, a weapon for my mother's social ambitions. When I arrived at the estate, the house buzzed with forced energy. My father sat in a corner of the living room staring into nothing. He looked smaller, somehow drained. Brennan lingered near him, shifting his weight, avoiding my eyes at first. When he finally glanced at me, guilt flickered across his expression like a shadow. In contrast, my mother swept into the room, glowing with the confidence of someone about to perform on stage. Her posture was perfect, her smile tight and poised, her appearance polished to hide every crack. She didn't look like a woman who had spent days screaming. She looked like a woman determined to rewrite history. She began speaking to the guests, business acquaintances, women from the Aspen charity circuit, people who had worshipped her image for years. Her tone was gentle, wounded, calculated. She told them I had been influenced, misled, that I had made impulsive decisions and fallen victim to reckless emotions. She implied that Isola was manipulative, that I was behaving irrationally, and that the Knox family was enduring a painful chapter because of my instability. Listening to her twist the truth into a performance of motherhood, I felt a calm rage settle through my body. I didn't wait for her to finish. I stepped forward, set the stack of documents I had brought, copies, not originals, on the coffee table, and spoke as plainly as I could. I told the room what she had done, the misappropriated funds, the manipulation, the investigator she hired to follow me, and the woman I loved. I watched faces shift. Some tried to hide their shock. Others lowered their eyes, suddenly aware they were standing in the middle of a crumbling empire. My mother's fury was immediate. She yelled, called me a liar, accused me of conspiring against her. But her voice cracked, and everyone heard it. The image she worked so hard to maintain fractured in real time. Then Brennan stood. For the first time in years, he looked like he wanted to be something other than her echo. He admitted she had given him money for 2 years. He admitted she encouraged him to antagonize Isola, to push my buttons, to stir conflict until I broke. His confession punched the air out of the room. My mother's face drained of color. She looked betrayed, not because he lied, but because he stopped lying for her. And then my father rose. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't speak with anger. He simply announced that he had filed for divorce. He said he couldn't live in a home built on control and deceit anymore. He acknowledged that she had hidden financial decisions from him and used the Knox name to manipulate and intimidate those she claimed to care for. His declaration took the last pillar out from under her. She stumbled, stepping backward as if struck. Before she could recover, the attorney walked into the room with the formal documents. He confirmed in front of everyone that my grandfather's personal assets had legally transferred to me after she attempted to remove me from the will. Her power, her primary tool for domination, was gone. Just like that. A lifetime of control dissolved in the span of minutes. There was nothing left to say. I walked out of the house without looking back. For the first time, I felt the sun on my face in Aspen without feeling its cold judgment. It felt like stepping out of a gilded cage I hadn't realized was locked until the moment it opened. Returning to Denver felt like exhaling after holding my breath for decades. When I opened the door to our apartment, the first thing I saw was Isla asleep on the sofa, a children's book resting open on her chest. The soft rise and fall of her breathing filled the room with a peace I had never known growing up. The contrast between where I'd been and where I stood now was almost overwhelming. For the first time in days, my shoulders dropped. Weeks later, when Isela went into labor, I held her hand through every contraction. When our daughter Lyra finally arrived, I held her against my chest and felt something inside me rewrite itself. All the old wounds, all the childhood scars, all the battles with my mother, none of them mattered in that moment. Lyra's tiny heartbeat against my skin made everything else feel distant, like an echo from a life I no longer lived. Her family filled the hospital room with warmth, colorful blankets, food containers, flowers, laughter. They celebrated Lyra with a joy so genuine it made my throat tighten. I had never experienced that growing up. The Knox holidays were full of performance. This was real. This was love without expectation or requirement. This was family. Brennan visited too. He didn't swagger or smirk. He didn't ask for anything. He apologized quietly and told me he wanted to be better, that he wanted to be the uncle Lyra deserved. I told him he could earn that chance, but it would take consistency and honesty, things our childhood never taught us. He nodded, accepting it without argument. It was the first adult conversation we had ever had, but peace didn't come without interruption. My mother emailed me a long letter claiming she was ready to forgive me, twisting the story to make herself the victim. I didn't respond. When the police contacted me to report she had hired someone to photograph Lyra at a shopping center, I felt my blood run cold. It was the final line she couldn't be allowed to cross. I filed a permanent restraining order and sent her the letter I had written before Christmas, the one that laid out the truth she refused to face. I told her I couldn't be part of her life anymore if it meant sacrificing the family I was building. A year passed. On Lyra's first birthday in our small backyard strung with lights, Isla and I renewed our vows. Only the people who truly loved us were there, her parents, her siblings, a couple of close friends, and Brennan standing quietly near the back holding a brightly wrapped gift for his niece. I spoke my promises out loud, the ones I knew I could keep now that I wasn't trying to live two lives. As the sun set, I felt something settle inside me. A beginning, not an ending. Now when I think of family, I think of early mornings in our home. I think of brewing coffee while Isela sketches at the dining table, of Lyra babbling in her crib as the light pours in. I think of the calm that replaced decades of anxiety. I think of how different life feels when it's filled with people who love you for who you are, not who they want you to be. Losing the Knox family wasn't a loss. It was release, freedom, a chance to choose something better. And sometimes that's the only way to truly start living, by letting go of the people who never believed you deserved love in the first place.